Good, Pascal. Episode 3. We are fighting with some technical issues. And that's because you are in China. That means we need to go via VPN and other things. And that's what we want to do here at the second horizon as well. Sometimes reporting on the ground where we are, wherever we are. And that comes sometimes with minor issues. And that's just the way it is. But
Yeah,
curious.
no, no, no. It's
Yeah,
no, it's
what,
been
what?
fantastic here in China. I'm in
Yeah.
Shanghai right now,
Mhm.
but yeah, no, I arrived, and one of the problems was that my SIM card was cancelled. So I was. That's why I got back to VPN mode because otherwise eSIM would, also would have worked better. But my phone didn't support that when I with the phone that I came in. So anyway, we're here. I'm in Shanghai. Fantastic. Had 2 weeks of tour with two different companies. Saw a lot of things. Lots of signals to be talked about. Lots of things that I noticed. How about yourself?
Amazing. Yeah, well, I'm also going to China next week already. So by the time you're leaving, I'm going to be there. So possibly our next episode will be just with the same technical issues or hurdles here to get a connection between the East and the West. But we're trying to do that. And yeah, curious to hear from you what you've been noticing now on your trip, what kind of signals you picked up, whether or not they are connected to your current trip or if it's just something else. And then obviously I need to get also my own feeling on what has changed because China's moving so fast. I've just been a couple of months out of China and now back. It will be so different, right? So yeah, curious. Maybe you start with a couple of your signals that you've got, and whether or not they are connected to what you've just noticed on the ground here.
Yeah, no, no, no. It's been a fantastic 2 weeks. Very intense. I've seen, I think, 25, maybe even 30 companies. I forgot the count, but it was a lot of companies in many different cities.
Mhm.
Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, been all over the place. And yeah, one of the signals that I noticed was definitely that many companies, or all the companies we talked to, except of course a few energy companies like State Grid, all of the others, all the private companies were looking for ways to go global, and that was very very clear,
Mhm.
and that's something that I think we are not realizing in the rest of the world, how eager they are to go outside of China, and not just because of the economy, but because of other reasons. The other signal was in front of me. That was basically the two sessions. I was there the week that it ended, and
Mhm.
people were talking about it, but I noticed that on international media that didn't have the attention it deserved, because this was the beginning of the next 5 year plan. And if we look at what China did over the last 5 years and extrapolate that with their ambition for the next 5 years, I think this is going to be a major thing as well. So something
Mhm.
we should truly pay attention to. And the last signal I wanted to share was about humanoid robots. We've talked about it in the last episode.
Mhm.
You bought one. You got one at home. I know that. And it has arms and legs. But I was actually completely taken by surprise with not the robots that are 100% looking like humanoids, but actually the robots that are used in factories, free roaming around. That was an interesting visit I did with one of the companies called Galbot, and I'll talk about that later on.
Super
So
interesting. Yeah,
yes, very much.
that's something that I really want to hear more of because my trip will also be a lot about going to factories, visiting
Hmm.
the robots companies, humanoids and not humanoid robots, both of them. But you seem to have an information advantage at this point, so that's good to hear. Let me just
Well, you'll
briefly
have
go.
that in a week from now when you're there, so
Yeah,
that's
no,
fine.
and that's what we can do here. We can share it to our viewers, and I think it's a very, like you said, very very fast paced time currently. Also, if we just speak about the progress in robotics, just one example. We all hear and see about the unitary robots dancing at the New Year gala, right? And then one of the pushback, I think, was about, well, this is all just orchestrated and programmed, and it is some sort of a setup that is not proving that those robots are fully autonomous or actually intelligent in a way that it would be a breakthrough. Well, now just a couple of weeks later, actually, I don't know if you've seen it, but we've seen a study from Tsinghua University where a robot was actually playing with a human and playing tennis on a tennis field, and that certainly cannot be programmed because the robot has to react to the ball as it's being played against by the human. And so this is quite interesting, just how fast things are going. But well, maybe more on that later when you talk about your experience. But just let me first go into the couple of signals that I have this time, maybe a bit more on the theoretical side compared to your on-the-ground reporting. I'm curious whether or not you also can confirm that from your, I guess you possibly also been to the Shenzhen area, but what I've been reading about is that there is a hype about OpenClaw and agentic AI implementation in China. You see images of people queuing up to learn more about OpenClaw and using it, even elderly people. So that's quite interesting. The second one, I think it's also something very underreported and where lots of people are not aware of, which is the domestic push by the Chinese industry. Well, we see it in automotive, but it's also connected to robotics into domestic chip manufacturing. So we can possibly talk more about that. And last but not least, whether or not you've heard about the token economy with Alibaba earnings. They have announced a couple of new changes regarding how they think of monetizing tokens and AI. So I think there's a shift happening currently in China. So yeah, these are maybe all a bit more about this AI layer and more the business side and economics on this tech platform. But maybe what's more on the minds of people now is hearing from you about your experiences
No,
that you
no.
just made on the trip, and maybe let's start with robotics if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I think all three of your signals I've been seeing as well. But the last 2 weeks I was so busy that I haven't been reading too much on what's happening in China. I've actually been looking
Mhm.
at what's happening in China and talking to people about what's happening on the ground. And yeah, one of the companies that I visited in Beijing was Galbot. And I thought this was a fantastic company. I mean, I visited Unitree as well, but just the difference between Unitree in Hangzhou and Galbot in Beijing was quite a surprise. And there's a few things that I really I wanted to share, because one of the things is that they were trying to really be the pragmatic humanoid robot company of China. And
Mhm.
what that means is that they are not trying to do the crazy jumps and loops and kung fu fights and all that cool stuff. And they themselves, and actually Unitree confirmed that when I met them a couple of days later, is that they do see humanoid robots entering the service of the industry environment with legs and arms in 3 to 5 years. That everybody feels it's cool, and there's going to be a lot of applications happening, a lot of crazy things they're going to develop. But before this really takes off, like the EV market took off like 5 years ago, it will take another 5 years. That's what kind of the consensus was.
Mhm.
So it means that, of course, being the Chinese, they are looking for practical solutions to implement tomorrow, and that's where Galbot came along. We visited them, and it was quite a surprise, because one of their main robots is actually a robot without legs, so
Mhm.
it's rolling through the
Mhm.
factory floor, and they can hold up to 50 kilos of things of really big material, and they can bring it to fixed robots, and this was working pretty impressive. This company is established in 2023, It's a 3-year-old company, not even, and they already are a unicorn. They got lots of money from CATL, the battery company, and this
Hmm.
is interesting. This robot, as you know, some of these robots they replace their own battery, but knowing that a battery company invests in a robot company that replaces its battery in order to help then the factory of CATL to become more efficient, I mean, this is a full circle. It was quite interesting to see. And we watched these robots work, and it was really impressive how they detected objects and went around them, and basically was quite fluent. And this was not programmed. This is all AI, so it's all artificial intelligence. I mean, of course, they're programmed some things, but they're constantly learning. So if you add new obstacles, they will learn from that, and this is quite a thing. So they're very close to the university, next to Peking University, Beijing
Hmm.
University, and so most of their graduates come from either Tsinghua or Peking University. And their secret is actually getting most of these students as interns to build a lot of applications and stuff.
Hmm.
But I was completely surprised. They already have a pharmacy that is actually operational, where
Hmm.
Meituan, the delivery company, is constantly getting orders from online. And
Hmm.
this pharmacy with fixed kind of pharmacy, meaning all the boxes look literally the same almost, but have different ingredients. It already works perfect. When there's different sizes and forms, it's a little bit more difficult, but this
Hmm.
is very practical. And it took like 2 minutes to get a box and put it into a box paper for the Beituan guide to take it out. So these were
Yeah,
things
that's.
that I felt like it's really happening.
Mm.
And maybe the last thing I want to share is that the price of this robot is almost $100,000. So
Hmm.
this is not what we always hear. Oh, these robots like Unitree, it's $13,000 and it's going to be cheap and whatever.
Yeah.
No, they're pricing it really high, and so they're looking for factory replacements of employees. And $100,000 sounds a lot of money, but if you think
Hmm.
about replacing a person, specifically in European factories, I mean,
Hmm.
this is okay. Very interesting company to look at.
Yeah, I think a couple of interesting things around this is, first of, you mentioned like how they're already going into deployment, not demos, and that might
Yep.
be surprising for people based in Europe or in the West in generally, because we still, I mean, in my talks with companies in Germany, for example, it's always still like, oh, is there actually a use case for these robots?
Hmm.
It's like they're still on the layer that are trying to understand it. Whereas you
Yeah.
reporting now in China, they're already
No, no.
implementing it. It's connected to, as you have pointed out, a whole ecosystem of even different companies, like you mentioned,
Hmm.
CATL, Meituan, and then the robot maker. So that's already building kind of this tech ecosystem and different players, and they're positioning each other's. Then what's interesting that you've mentioned is also relating to even how those industries are converging, like EV makers or battery makers.
Yep.
CATL has an interest into robotics because battery swapping is a topic which they are getting
Hmm.
into, by the way, for EVs, like replenishing power
Yep.
by swapping the battery instead of fast charging, something that NIO has pioneered. Now CATL is doing that for cars. But now you
Also
mentioned
for
that they are,
robots. Yes.
yeah, they're bringing it into robotics as well, and so that's where their interest is. And you mentioned the economics as well. Yes, the robots are quite expensive in the for industry applications right now, but they are falling, like those cost curves are coming down like 50% year over year still. So you can just imagine where they're going to be in a couple of years. And I think these companies are investing heavily in it right now because it's already making economic sense to them. Uh, Even if it's maybe still a losing game right now on a bottom line in technical terms, but the learning rates are so quick now that if you don't have them now in this first iteration, in the second iteration, you might be falling behind, right? And then CATL coming in now in this regard of battery swapping because they see the opportunity here to
Hmm.
increase the uptime of the robotics, which is an economic impact for the factory owners in the end. So you see all of these loops are getting into place already in this big China tech ecosystem, in a sense, how you just described it, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it goes even further because they also have these robots in kiosks to make coffee and stuff like that. So but what was interesting is that to promote these boxes or these kiosks for coffee making, or there was one
Hmm.
to actually make sausages and give it to you. I mean, it was really funny.
Hmm.
But you would say, why would I use this? Okay, but to promote this, and this was what I thought was so crazy, they actually programmed a Unitree robot in front of their kiosk with a T-shirt of Galbot to actually get people to attract to see what it was happening. They did the same thing with this. You can find it online. There's a tennis match played with a robot. I don't know if you saw that. So there's a robot playing tennis with a person, and
Yeah.
that is a Unitree robot, but it's programmed by Galbot. And this is interesting because everybody says Galbot has basically this robot playing tennis, and they do, but this is promotion. And so they
Hmm.
use other people's robot to attract their other robots, which are much more pragmatic. But I asked the VP, and I said, yeah, but I mean, why are you using your competitor's robot to promote your own robot? I mean, this sounds so weird. And he said,
Hmm.
yeah, but I mean, we all know each other. We're all coming from the same universities. We all have the same classmates and friends. And so, yeah, we're just helping each other out. And although we're competing in one way, we're
Hmm.
also helping each other because this is an ecosystem that is being built. And I
Hmm.
was just thinking, I mean, can you imagine in Europe companies asking their competitor or using their competitor's product to promote your own product? I think very
Hmm.
few would do it. So I think this is all about this collaboration. And they've already sold 1,000 robots. So it's not just a startup anymore. They're a unicorn worth more than $2 billion. So this is going very fast. So I think many people in Europe will want to look at for their factory if this could be useful because and not just Galbot, there's others as well. But I'm just giving this example because the Chinese factories are just gonna absorb it. This is what I saw at Xiaomi. I mean, a lot
Hmm.
of these fixed robots, but also starting to experiment with flexible half or semi-humanoid robots. Doesn't sound really sounds a little bit weird to say semi-human, but but that's what it is.
So you talk about this collaborative approach, which, by the way, I'm also seeing in the EV industry. I don't know if you've seen, but now Xiaomi is just bringing out new models and updating its fleet. And what's interesting is that the social media accounts of their competitors are all congratulating Xiaomi, and have seen that Xiaomi before, like Lei Jin, on stage is endorsing some of their competitors, like saying, "Look, we've got this new model here; it's great." But by the way, if that's not something for you, go and buy a Neo or go and buy the other brands and stuff. So it's truly interesting what you've just pointed
Mm-hmm.
out with how these players are in some way in the most fierce competition. And there's also a couple of foul play agendas that are being quite hidden. And, they're really fighting. Like that was also some people are saying China's a great fitness center actually for European companies because the fighting is so immense. On the other hand, this collaborative approach is really something that sets their strategy or their, I don't know, their competitive approach apart from what we are usually seeing in the West. So I don't know how to deal with that from a Western point of view. Actually, like this is kind of what sometimes even brings up these conspiracy theories about the government being behind all of that, and the Chinese companies conspiring together on really competing unfairly. But I think it's maybe rather something cultural and also rooted in the way innovation is building on what others are doing in a sense, right? It's also there's lots of iterative innovation happening where some company in China locally invents something new, and suddenly all of the competitors will bring out something similar, but quite in a different angle of trying to find a unique selling proposition as well. I don't know if you've seen something or
Yeah,
also noticed
I've
something like this.
no, I've seen. I visited the Xiaomi factory.
Hmm.
I visited the BYD factory this week, and it's clear. Even BYD a couple of years ago had an advertisement which was advertising all the Chinese top cars in their ads, and they were just, it was talking about the EV economy, and I do believe there's two things. I think from a competitive point of view, they're really fierce competitors, but it's more to win the market, being basically surviving by going as fast as possible and being as smart as possible. But they want the industry to succeed, and if the industry and the ecosystem succeeds, then they succeed in a way as well. Of course, I think companies like BYD and Xiaomi are examples of companies that already are in that premium layer, and they can
Mhm.
afford basically to talk about others because they don't need to be. I mean, they're not going to get slaughtered as quickly as some smaller ones. But I think it's true. It's all about the ecosystem, and then I think in a way you're right. It's partially commercial internally, but it's also what the government is supporting for ecosystem to be built, and they are supporting that. So I've seen this the whole week. They're not talking about. They're not talking their competitors down. They're basically talking about the ecosystem being built and they being a
Mhm.
part of that puzzle.
Yeah. I'm curious on your take, maybe to switch to one of your signals in a second about the next 5-year plan and 2 sessions. But what I want to bring in before that is maybe connected to what we're just talking about robotics, EV, competition, and the whole ecosystem. My signal was about domestic chips manufacturing. I think there was one interesting stat that the exports of domestic chips from China have been rising, but not so
Hmm.
much on the unit economics, but more on the overall volume, which is telling us that not more chips are being sold, but actually more revenues generated with that. And China
Mm.
thereby is growing on the value ladder here. So that in combination with, we see all of the announcements from the EV companies building their own autonomous driving chips. That's number one. And then we see the AI companies building their own inference chips compute, like Alibaba, Baidu is doing it, a couple of other companies. And again, this is connecting ecosystems. It's connecting different industries that are merging, like robotics. They will need chips. The same chips can go into cars and so on. And I think that's underappreciated and underdiscovered so far, of how much, also maybe based on sanctions and so on, not Neo, China is pushing to this domestic chips manufacturing and drive, because it's connecting everything. And now doing the switch to your signal, 2 sessions and the 5-year plan, maybe that's also part of this bigger, yeah, government view and picture where China needs to be headed. Do you have
Yeah,
any thoughts?
no, it's very clear, and I totally agree with what you're saying. But this is something I've written in my book, that this is about this new quality productive forces,
Hmm.
where the quality part is really not about just volume anymore. It's about value, and creating more value is what many of the companies, specifically in the more high advanced and high tech sectors like the chip sector, are going for. I've seen it in other industries. I've seen a lot in the energy industry as well, with wind turbines and inverters and all that thing. And as I always say, if this continues, I mean, the Chinese are not going to compete on price; they're going to compete on value over time.
Hmm.
And so this whole ecosystem, specifically in the chips industry, I mean, I visited Huawei; they were talking about it. It's clear that there's an incentive and a push from the government in the 5-year plan that this
Hmm.
is one of the big things that they need to get right. And they got 5 years to basically get it right. I mean, they might not be able to do everything that TSMC does,
Hmm.
but then again, who knows in 5 years how the situation is between China and Taiwan and the world. But in all the chips that they themselves now have started to develop, specifically in the data centers, you could really see that this is a push from the government of the next 5-year plan. And it's going to be all about R&D. So one of the signals I wanted to talk about is that China, in the next 5-year plan, has decided to basically do the spending of R&D as a growth of 7% every year. So now, right now, it's a little bit under 3% of the GDP, the whole R&D.
Mhm.
Of course, most is still D, but even the R, the research, is going up every year faster and faster as a percentage of the R&D. And 7% per year. And last year's was like 8% that it grew every year.
Mhm.
Knowing that China, and that's the GDP projections for the next year, for 2026, I mean, for this year, is between 4.5% and 5%. I mean, there's the R&D grows 3 to 4 times. I mean, 3% more than the GDP, and so that means that China is actually catching up very fast in R&D expenditures, and that is all about the new things. It's about brain-computer interface, about quantum, about 6G. It's about the low altitude economy, chips, AI. All these things is part of it, and it's not just trying to be a Me Too product or catching up with the US anymore. It's really about setting standards. And this is where
Mhm.
I truly felt on this tour, this was the main takeaway for me, is that Chinese companies are starting to set global standards
Mhm.
because they're producing the volume, the capacity, and buying it for their own market, meaning that market is so heavy. If you think
Mhm.
about wind turbines, for example, or solar panels, I mean, that's from the past, but today it's about new things like 6G, quantum, and these things. And if they start setting standards and globalize it, and in the next 5 year plan, Xi Jinping and the government clearly said that setting standards and having global ideas or global norms on environment and other things is something China now wants to do. So I think we need to be here in China. That's my conclusion of that.
Mhm.
Not just for the market anymore, but to see which are the standards that China is starting to develop. That ultimately is going to be implemented everywhere in the world because they have the biggest capacity on building them in many of these industries. And chips will be just one of them. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to follow how the next 5 years will play out. But I think this 5 year plan, it follows very well what I
Mhm.
expected, and I wrote in my book before it was announced. And it's really about giving China 5 years to ultimately start setting the norm for how they want to build a smart society. And yeah, some things will work, some things won't work, but it's if you're not aware, you might get hit by the things coming out of China.
Yeah, this standards topic is really fascinating to watch because now, if we talk about robotics, this space is moving so fast, as I just pointed out before, with from the Unitary demo to the robot playing tennis, which you're also referencing to. Like this intelligence pace is so fast. Like the technical part is one side, but then also more than 200 companies now moving in that direction. And again,
Mm-hmm.
we'll see who gonna be the winners. Maybe now still much too early to tell. Then they are collaborating while competing. So this is a very difficult kind of a beehive to understand, like what's really the outcome of it, but really where the European companies may have to start looking close because, as you've pointed out, that might create global standards in the future. And I think we are now not at the point where we can think about compliance or regulations that make any sense yet, because it will be too hard to grasp. Just those iterations, those steps on the technical level, they're happening still too fast that if you now try to standardize or regulate something, it will be irrelevant in just a couple of months already, right? So, and this is exactly why China may have the upper hand here on the standardization that is to come in the future, because it's just where it's happening, where it's being deployed, as you pointed out, not just demos, because it's just kind of a lived reality where factory owners are deploying those robots, and then kind of from that we will get at one point where ultimately the government may actually also step in again and say, okay, now we have to structure where the data can come from and where it can stay inside, and all of these regulatory approaches, where I feel, but correct me if I'm wrong here, or where you see it differently, that we're not in this phase currently where really the government is putting the hand on top of it and saying, we need more regulation at this point. I think it's rather maybe how you pointed out with the 2 sessions and the 5-year plan, where they are setting kind of the lines to operate within, and then within that they can now find solutions in a sort of a market system, right? Where there's demand, where there is the supply for it, and then we're going through this messy phase, and by the end of it, we will have those standards that are going to shape also the global industries. It's sort of where I'm
Yeah,
looking at.
and I think there's just to add on that. I think there's two directions. There's a push and a pull,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the government is clearly pushing to set certain global standards, also for self-reliance and making sure that they can be self-sufficient in certain industries, like the chip industry. It's very clear, or humanoids, which is a new industry. They want to be able to control mainly the how this gets deployed. But I
Mm-hmm.
also feel that there's a pull element, which is very much about the global markets. And that was my other signal that I was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
pulling these, or the Chinese pushing outside of China and getting pulled by the global markets. And the global markets are starting to really, like in Europe, like in the US, but definitely in Europe and in the global South, some need really high quality products. And the Chinese are adjusting this to every single market. And so they're starting to play in that league that we've always played on, which is a league of high standardized products. And so that becomes their normal. So their new normal in this industry is really to buy both by what the government is pushing, but also what the European and developed markets are pulling them towards, to actually standardize in the right direction. So these two combined is actually making the Chinese a lot more effective and efficient. And I think this is where I was in, just to add on I've met a lot of energy companies, and also State Grid and China Southern Grid, and a lot of companies in the energy sector.
Mm-hmm.
And what I noticed was that, uh, if we ask them, like, yeah, how do you do with like EV chargers, or how do you do like with batteries, or how do you do with the grid and the ultra high voltage lines, and how do you get all these things to go so fast in scaling throughout the country? And the
Mm-hmm.
answer is standards. I mean, they set standards for many of these things, and these companies all go into that same direction, and it's very fastly implemented in some aspects. And this was a little bit ridiculous, but it was China did what we do, what it takes us in Europe 2 years, China did in 10 days.
Mm-hmm.
And that was about, yeah, grid connections. So
Mm-hmm.
just to give you one example, and this has to do with chargers and stuff like that as well. I saw an EV charger. I mean, a BYD,
Mm-hmm.
a car being charged up to 97% in less than 10 minutes. Drive that can drive 1,000 kilometers, so 900
Yeah.
kilometers. This was crazy. You just could see it. And normally you would say after 70 or 80% it would slow down, but it didn't. It went all the way up to 97.
Mm-hmm.
And this was in less than 10 minutes. I think 7, 8, 9 minutes. It was fully charged. It's
I've got the
just
feeling that, you know,
incredible.
all of these examples that we're now talking about, they seem to happen because China is really good at connecting those different pieces, from a technological, but also from a standardization point of view. Like
Hmm.
this sort of orchestration is really what we may not have in the same way here in Europe, for example, and that's why we have so many examples that we can bring up from different industries and every day, because this is kind of fostering all of that to spring up. That's kind of the way I'm seeing it here. So it's really innovation and technological systems that are creating instead of just products, right? But the question is like
Yeah.
regarding your signal, then also whether or not this can truly be exported, because I got the same feeling that you got as a signal now that China's moving increasingly to globalizing. Actually,
Hmm.
that was one of my main takeaways after coming back after the COVID years, and that was an interesting one because we in the West we always hear just about decoupling and moving away from China, and actually tariffs being put into place and hurdles and so on. So it made it actually feel less and less likely that Chinese companies would actually start exporting and going stronger out of the domestic markets and into the global markets. But exactly, this is the signal I got as well. Now you repeating the same one, so that's super interesting. And yeah, but what I'm curious about your view is like how do you rate the success for that? Like, because in my views, also the Chinese companies are still struggling with going globally overseas. But maybe that's too European focused, because you also mentioned the global South, where there might be much more.
No, I think you're right, and I think that's an opportunity for us in
Mhm,
Europe and for many companies and governments. It's clear the Chinese are. I mean, I visited 25 companies in the last 2 weeks. I think 20 out of them talked to me about going global. But all of them were listening very careful on how to do it. So what they realize is that there's actually not too many success cases in Chinese companies going global. They're trying to figure it out. Of course, they have their way of doing things. They know once they go to Europe or they go to Latin America, the planning is different, the financing is different, the payment system everything is different in every different country, and this is exactly where they don't really know, and that's why they
mhm,
usually go first to big countries like America, or they go to France, to Germany, to the larger countries, so that they have volume.
mhm.
But their competitors go there too, and so they need to now think broader. And the lesson I've learned in the last 2 weeks after talking to all these companies is that they clearly need help. They don't always realize how much help they need.
Yeah.
But one of the values that we have, or the uniquenesses that we have in Europe, which we are completely not using, is our way to internationalize. If you think about how many companies in Germany, in Belgium, even in France, and in Holland, and all these countries have built, I mean, hundreds, 50 or 100 countries, and got offices and been successful in all these countries, adapting. So we got the secret. We know the secret of how to be successful very often in internationalizing, and the Chinese are struggling with it. And so there's a
Mhm.
clear need. There's a supply and demand in that market. The only question is, how do you get these building blocks together? Because in the Chinese mind, they start from, yeah, this is planned. This is, I mean, they start from an ecosystem. They start from collaboration. So they start from a very different inside out view, and then they go outside, and then people are expecting something completely different, and I think that's where the translation is actually an opportunity. So after 2 weeks, my takeaway of all these visits is that Europe has a unique opportunity and position, much better than the US or than any other player probably in the world, to help the Chinese go global in many places in the world. And if you then look, for example, in the energy sector, where I've also been active for a week, how China is really starting to invest heavily in energy in Africa,
Mhm.
in Latin America, in all these places. This is our know-how, and somehow I mean, I know the Chinese need it. The question is only, how can you help it so it helps you? And right now, my feeling is the Chinese are willing to share their ideas, their markets, their new markets with other countries, and even share technology in order to succeed in these areas. So it is a unique opportunity, but that's probably not how many people see it.
All right, Pascal, I think we are nearing towards the end of the podcast because we had to be fighting with a couple of technical issues this time, but it might just repeat next time when I'm in China and you're back in Europe, but that's the way it goes. So let me jump quickly to my last signal, which I also had, which is about this AI tokenization. And that's maybe
Yeah.
something where you already have some more insight than I have. But I hope to see it when I'm on the ground in Shenzhen, starting from the next weeks. So I've got a feeling that there is something happening around the question of how to monetize AI. So China went by going open source with, to the surprise to many of the US companies who are usually enjoying monopolies. That's their business model. Then China came in with DeepSeek and so on, and all of these open source models, which I think tune in well into what we've described before of this whole integrated ecosystem and how innovation is benefiting from that. But now we see with Alibaba and others announcing some shifts in the area, how they are charging for LLMs and also how they are restructuring, that it seems to be still work in progress with how fast the ecosystem and the innovation in AI is moving towards agentic AI and so on, that still China is also experimenting at this stage of how to bring this technology into the market and how it actually will benefit these companies. So it's quite of a very open, big picture and question, but maybe you've seen some things on the ground. We've heard about these people are experimenting with OpenClaw. This kind of a hype. That's always interesting when you see lots of companies and even individuals going to a technology in China. So that's maybe an open-end question that we cannot answer in this episode, but something that I would still want to highlight here on this episode as the last signal to talk about.
Yeah, no, and I think we should talk about this maybe next time. I do. The one thing that I noticed with pretty much every company in the first week that I visited, which was not about the energy sector, but was about basically advertisement sector and the social media sector and so on. And everybody, every single company, ByteDance, of course, Tencent. We went to many companies. Aichi. I went to Rednote, to Xiaohongshu. All
Mm-hmm.
these companies, but also smaller companies. Everybody. I mean, AI was basically their lifeline. This was
Mm-hmm.
really what they believe they are becoming, if they are not already an AI company. One of the most interesting factors that I saw was a company in the advertising space that basically said no AI, no bonus, no promotion. And that means that if you work in this company and you're not using AI for anything AI can do as well as you do, basically you're not going to get a bonus and not going to get a promotion. And they actually verify or check how good your AI skills are of certain tools that are used inside the company. So everything is built around it. And I've written also in my last newsletter about this tokenization and how
Mm-hmm.
ultimately China is basically beating the US hands down in numbers, in just quantity of how much it is being used. While the US feels like it's, or if we read about it, it's like they're in charge. But one interesting graphic that I always use now, and I've noticed, is that only 0.3% of the world's population is actually paying the $20 to ChatGPT or
Mm-hmm.
other AI. And
Mm-hmm.
so most people are using these open source or free models or testing around, and the Chinese models are just a lot more interesting for many developers and many companies to try out things. And this is where I think it's going to be more about the token price
Mm-hmm.
rather than the service agreements that people have with the big companies. That I'm paying $20 to OpenAI every month, and I'm paying some to Manus as well. And but I think this is going to become a very different battle over time. But the market is completely open, and I think we have a very different view on the AI market or the large language model market, because we think, yeah, the US is dominating. There's about 2 billion people using AI, but there's still, most of them are not paying for it. And I think that's where the business model will go more into the applications than the models
Yeah.
itself. The models are becoming commodities,
Yeah.
I didn't see the people lining up at Tencent when I visited there, but I
Hmm.
can believe this is actually happening much faster than we expect.
Yeah, I think that's hopefully a couple of examples I can bring on to the next episode when I'm on the ground, because I think what I will be observing is what you've mentioned, like again, the implementation, the pragmatic use already. So not just about the smartness of AI, but actually AI driving actual decisions day to day in the physical world, not so much only in benchmarks or theoretical systems, but rather the scaled and broad application of such. And
Mm,
so,
yeah,
yeah, this token economy will just add again another layer in this ecosystem of different incentives of how those Chinese players are thinking and acting and collaborating in a surprising manner to us as observers in some ways, right? So I
yeah,
think that's really important to understand because yeah, we oftentimes only read the headlines, and that's actually what we are trying to achieve here in this podcast, going a bit deeper. And those headlines are oftentimes just about the benchmarks, like if it's 99.99 something percent, and how does it compare to OpenAI? But it's missing the point of that this is not where those companies are thinking about anymore. In the end, it's not so much about the smartness anymore, but actually
no,
about the usability in the end, right? And I
yeah.
think that's also
No, and
what's
I
yeah.
saw it on a very large scale. So you see
Mhm.
it in small inside offices, but I saw it with wind turbines, which is one example I wanted to share. Maybe the last one. It's I mean, in China, Envision is one of the big companies in wind turbines, and they also do battery systems and other kind of all kinds of solar panels and hydrogen and everything they have. And then what they do is basically they have these wind turbines and they place them based on what the wind, basically the weather report. So the weather report, which is completely AI driven and real time, is ultimately telling these wind turbines how to position and how to turn. And they don't position them nicely in rows like we often do in Europe, but they position them everywhere based on the averages of what the weather has been over the past 10, 20 years. And it's just mind boggling that they would use AI as a decision taker completely to optimize the energy of these things and are increasing the energy efficiency with, I mean, 20, 30% just because of that. And yeah, I think it's a lot of smart things that are being put in there, and this on very large projects. And we could say, yeah, we have this as well, but ultimately, I think letting AI decide how systems are running is what China is now not experimenting anymore, but actually deploying with products and systems on a very large scale. So I was really impressed by this company, and we can talk about it
Mhm.
another time, but. AI is truly being implemented in real users cases in China, and there's many in every industry.
Yeah, that's actually a great closing line, Pascal. I'm happy it worked and we got your insight from China. Really, that is a great place to go for observing those things early, I guess. And my learning from today's session, or maybe also for the viewers, has been that we seem to be up against a whole system that is being orchestrated here, and not a specific product. And that's something, yeah, that hopefully I will also see more of next week, and can also bring many more examples. So yeah, I hope everybody liked this episode again. If so, smash a like, follow us for more on these topics. And I think there are many more topics that we still have left out. We haven't talked about some macro issues currently happening, but you see us more
Yeah,
excited even about the tech that we don't even need to mention the war in Iran, really, right? But there's many more things we can follow up, and we also have agreed to make one specific episode on chips and specifically, or silicon. So maybe when we are both back in Europe. But anyways, that's a lot for you guys to hopefully look forward to. And yeah, I hope you appreciate our second horizon perspective on things. So thanks, Pascal. I hope you have a great end of your trip in China, and everybody,
yes,
see you soon.
Yeah, see you next episode. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, everybody.